Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hey, it's Jeff. Welcome back to one of my favorite parts of the month, which is when I get to come talk all about historical ballot measures with someone from our ballot measures team. So I'm excited to be here with Victoria Rose today. We're going to talk about Arizona, which I just was reminded was the 48th state, which means it was the last state in the continental U.S. to receive its statehood. So we're going to have a little bit of fun talking all about the ballot measures that we've seen since they became a state, or maybe even before that. So Victoria, what's up? Welcome back.
Happy to be back. I'm excited for this episode specifically because I lived in Arizona for a good portion of my life. So I know all about its starting history. Valentine's Day is Arizona's anniversary for its statehood. So
I didn't know that.
Another
romantic Arizona. Yeah, beautiful. It's very hot out there, though. You remember that? I'm sure you haven't forgotten.
I never go back and visit in July.
Yeah, I know. Well, we had this great idea about all sorts of topics to talk about with respect to Arizona, but given what's going on nationally with respect to ballot measures and redistricting, we thought actually we should flip it up a little bit and let's talk about redistricting. As you probably know, if you're listening to this podcast, it means you pay attention to politics, which means you probably know what's going on with redistricting nationally, with Texas and with California, and with the upcoming ballot measures that couldn't appear before voters in California this November. Let's talk a little bit about redistricting and its history as a ballot measure in Arizona before we delve into the more than 500 other measures that we're going to kind of talk about a little bit today. So Arizona is one of those states with a independent redistricting commission. So how do they get that?
Yeah, they adopted it in 2000 with the adoption of Prop 106. Like you said, it was an initiative that was approved with 56% of the vote, making Arizona one of 11 states that uses a independent commission for congressional redistricting, and then one of 16 states for legislative redistricting.
Yeah, and obviously we're not going to spend a lot of time on redistricting today. If you want more about that, you can certainly visit ballotpedia.org and read all of our articles about it. But Arizona is one of the earlier states, I think, with respect to passing a ballot measure specifically for a redistricting commission. And I remember this in part because in my early years of Ballotpedia, from 2010 to 12 in that era, there was a lot of chatter nationally about the Arizona model, about Arizona's redistricting commission. The 2010 process was their second time actually using their commission. So Arizona has been a pretty prominent player in redistricting, and their ballot measure was one of the early ones, right?
Right. And it's a smaller commission, like compared to California. Arizona has 5 members on their commission, and I think California has 13 members or 14 members.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of them are significantly smaller. And really before 2000, I'm kind of poking around some of our data right now, there were very few redistricting ballot measures before that. There was a really small one in Alaska in 1998. There was one that was defeated in Wyoming in 1996. New Jersey had its commission established in 1995. But really a true independent redistricting commission. There were very few measures throughout the 80s and 90s until Arizona's 2000. So one of the last states, one of the first with a redistricting commission. And so we'll be paying very close attention at Ballotpedia and on your ballot measures team, Victoria, to what happens in California in the coming weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about Arizona now, specifically with its historical ballot measures. Nearly 500 ballot measures since 1911, which was actually the year before it became a state, which is pretty fun. Which is quite a few ballot measures considering they've had one of the shortest time periods to have ballot measures. So what do we know about approvals and disapprovals and the types of measures that have seemed to be the most prominent in Arizona?
Before we jump right into the approval rate, I thought it'd be fun to talk about the adoption of Arizona's constitution and Arizona becoming a state because it involves direct democracy. So Arizona voters approved a state constitution in February 1911, was all ready to become a state. And then President Taft actually vetoed the resolution that would have admitted them to the Union because Arizona's constitution included a provision for judicial recall, which he was against. He actually issued a very long veto message calling for that to be removed from the state constitution. He said it was destructive of the independence of the judiciary and a lot of other things. It was a very long message. He, however, did acknowledge, he's like, they can remove it from the state constitution, be admitted to the states, and then add it later, because the state constitution included initiative and referendum, which he was fine with it including. And sure enough, after Arizona became a state on February 14, 1912, later that year at the general election, they adopted the judicial recall, as well as President Taft came in fourth place during the presidential election in Arizona as a, I guess, retribution for his.
He has about that.
Yeah. So just a fun little direct democracy story about Arizona's beginnings.
Yeah, judicial recall. You never know what topic's going to motivate voters. I imagine that there must have been some kind of, judicial scandal that was going on in the early 1900s in either nationally or in Arizona that really ginned up the petition.
Yeah, it was probably playing into the national progressive movement in general. But looking at the approval rate in Arizona, voters have approved about 51% of all measures and rejected slightly under 50% of those measures. But it looks a little different when you break it up by type. So measures referred to the ballot by the state legislature saw a 60% approval rate, and that was about 255 measures, so a little bit more than half. And then citizens put 219 measures on the ballot, and they saw an approval rate of 45%. So kind of significantly lower than the legislative referrals, which is not uncommon for what we've seen in other historical ballot measure data. And then Arizona has also voted on 20 measures put on the ballot by a constitutional convention or a state commission, and those had the lowest approval rate with 20%.
Those have not been on the ballot for quite some time in most states, those constitutional convention ones. Arizona, one of our states that is also an initiative state, right? So that we're talking about ballot measures that are not just put on the ballot by the legislature. Arizona in particular has been kind of an interesting state, right, in recent years, because you have the sort of competing ballot measure landscape. Initiatives that have been in many ways put on the ballot by either minority party or from minority party activists. Then you have legislative referred measures from the alternative party. So always a very interesting climate out in Arizona. Now, the volume of measures related to immigration, that's pretty interesting, right? So they've had more measures related to that topic than any other state, probably because of the border, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think the obvious answer is because they're on the border. But I looked at the other border states just to compare the number. Arizona has voted on 9 measures related to immigration. They're set to vote on a 10th measure in 2026. California's voted only on 4, 3 in the 1950s, 1 in 1994. New Mexico has had 2 in the early 2000s, and then Texas has never voted on an immigration measure, which is kind of surprising. Arizona and California are the 2 initiative, well, New Mexico has the veto referendum, but the 2 initiative states on the border. Texas doesn't have an initiative, so I think that might play into why Texas has never seen it. They only have legislative referrals. But the measures themselves are pretty interesting, just even across time. So the first one appearing in 1914, voters approved an initiative requiring an employer to have at least 80% of their employees be U.S. citizens. And then some other ones later, in 2004, voters approved Proposition 200, which required the verification of immigration status to receive public benefits. And then in 2008, voters rejected Prop 202, which would have suspended or revoked business licenses if it was found that they intentionally employed people who entered the U.S. in violation of immigration law. And then just last year, they actually approved Prop 314, which made it a state crime for non-citizens to enter the state at any location other than a legal port of entry. So just like a pretty wide range of immigration policies, and obviously different. Not all of them were approved, as we saw in 2008.
The comparison to other states is a really interesting way to flag what makes the ballot measure landscape so interesting and how it evolves in different states. So, for instance, to your point, I mean, Texas doesn't need to have very many immigration ballot measures because if they want to pass a law, the legislature would do it. Unless they're going to change the Constitution, it doesn't have to go before voters. They don't have the initiative, so therefore it's not like voters can come bring their own version of a law to the ballot. Whereas, in Arizona, you might have a situation where citizens might decide they want a law that the legislature is not putting forth, so they bring their own initiative. Or if the legislature is trying to put something in the Constitution, they might put it before voters. So each state's different landscape impacts how they're going to actually, what kind of ballot measures they're going to see. So
yeah, the topics that get addressed.
One.
For sure.
So what's the process like for getting measures on the ballot in Arizona? Speaking of the different kinds of measures they're going to see, how does that work?
Yeah, so in Arizona, like we said, they have the initiative process, which they adopted in 1911. It was established with the ratification of the state constitution. And the signature requirements are based on a certain percentage of the vote of the last gubernatorial election, which is pretty standard for initiative states. In Arizona, the state legislature can also, like you said, put measures on the ballot. To put a measure on the ballot, one vote, a simple majority vote in one session is required, which is a comparatively low bar across legislative referral states, which is all but one of them, Delaware. A lot of other states, nearly half, require supermajorities or multiple sessions to put something on the ballot. So it's part of the reason why we saw so many legislative referrals last election, 2024. Arizona had 11 legislatively referred measures.
Yep.
Part of this was due to its divided government. So Republicans control the state legislature, and then they have a Democratic governor. So a lot of legislative priorities that were either had been vetoed or possibly could have been vetoed by the governor were sent to voters where they thought they would have a better chance of being passed. And with the legislatively referred state statutes, all but one of them was approved in 2024.
And that's particularly interesting because and we now know this from our historical data. So if all but one of those laws were approved last year, that's a much higher rate than historically referred measures are approved at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what are some of the more interesting things you learn when you look through the data? This is kind of our favorite part of these episodes is, when you're looking through hundreds of different ballot measures, there's always a few that stand out for different reasons. So what jumped out when you were looking through the data?
Yeah, especially in these initiative states, right? Because citizens are coming up with these ideas, which they can take more of a political gamble with because they're not running for election, obviously. The very first initiative that Arizona ever decided on was actually an initiative to give women the right to vote and allow them to run or hold public office, which was approved. And then we've already discussed redistricting, so I'll move past that. Another notable topic that's kind of been in the news lately that has a history in Arizona is English as an official language. There have been 3 measures related to the use of English in Arizona. It was designated as the state's official language via ballot measure in 1988. That was also a ballot initiative. However, it was overturned by the state Supreme Court, saying it violated the First and 14th Amendment of the federal Constitution. However, in 2006, they readopted an amendment declaring it as the official language, but adding a provision saying we can use other languages in official state documents and things like that. So it kind of abide by the state Supreme Court's ruling. And then there's one of the hottest topic in Arizona is actually administration of government. That saw the most number of ballot measures. One that stood out to me was in 1992, voters approved Proposition 108, which required a 2/3 vote of each legislative chamber to pass legislation that increases state revenue through taxes or changes how tax revenues are distributed among local governments. So a supermajority requirement for state spending. And then another just fun random data point is that there were 12 measures out of the 494 that were decided by less than a percentage point of the vote, which kind of seems like a lot.
The really close margins of victory are always really interesting. When we're done with this whole project, we'll be able to really sit down and see like how many nationally were decided by that kind of a margin. The Prop 108 in 1992 that we were talking about with the 2/3 vote, that feels a little bit like that's an extension of the California tax revolt, which we talked about in this show before. That's quite a few years after that. Was there any connection to that?
I would have to jump into the archives and see if like the arguments were drawing upon the same arguments from the support side. It was an initiative, so, and obviously California was also initiative, so definitely could have played off.
Yeah, well, so what's cooking on the horizon this year for Arizona? What's coming up next year? Because like you said, it does change quite a bit because the legislature can, with just one session, right? They can put things on the ballot. So we don't usually find out Arizona's ballot measure final landscape really until like October of the even year. It's one of the later sort of like finalized ballots. But what do we know at least at this juncture?
Yeah, so obviously nothing on the ballot this year with an odd numbered year, but the state legislature was in session and has referred to the ballot 3 measures already, 2 state statutes and 1 constitutional amendment. One statute would declare that drug cartels are terrorist organizations and require the State Department of Homeland Security to do everything in its authority to address that. This is one of those immigration measures I brought up earlier. The other proposed law would prohibit local governments from imposing or increasing taxes on the sale of food items without voter approval and cap that tax rate at 2%. And then the constitutional amendment would prohibit state and local governments from imposing taxes or fees based on vehicle miles traveled and from enacting rules to monitor or limit vehicle miles traveled without person's consent, which kind of seems a little random. And then there are 3 potential initiatives, including a veto referendum pending. The veto referendum is against a law that would allow zoning exemptions for housing or hotels to be built on corporations' campuses that have international headquarters in certain municipalities in Arizona. And then another initiative would limit the compensation executives and managers of hospitals or other healthcare facilities receive. So those are all pending. And I imagine the veto referendum probably has a circulation deadline sooner than the regular deadline for the outstanding initiatives.
Well, if we come on this show 1 year from now, I imagine that it will look very different and have a very different set of...
By a multiple, yeah. The number of measures.
Yeah,
sure.
Well, that's Arizona for you. Well, great. Well, Victoria, always fun to talk ballot measures with you. And we'll escape the heat of Arizona now and I'll move onward.
Always great to talk ballot measures. Everyone can check out all that information at the link in our show notes about the Arizona Fact Book on historical ballot measures.
Yeah. We'll be back soon with another episode. Make sure you subscribe On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts or watch them. I'm Geoff Pallay. Thanks for listening or viewing.